Turning a blind eye towards our own hostile imagination is a recipe for disaster. Our tendency towards adversarial self-enhancement was important, transformative, and entirely appropriate when we were teenagers, when we first started to challenge parental and cultural beliefs and expectations by forming our own personal preferences and poorly informed prejudices with a sense of righteousness, rebelliousness, and never before seen originality. Or at least that's what I thought as I brooded over My Chemical Romance, asking myself if my life-hating, tortured edginess looked more or less tortured with my fringe swept to the left or to the right. But we're not teenagers anymore, are we? And the next stage of our personal maturation calls for a new relationship with our unconscious projection and internalized hostility, unless you're particularly attached to unnecessary suffering, time loss, energy loss, and perpetual shadowboxing. Quick disclaimer, although I put How to Heal in the title, I can guarantee that you will not have resolved your lifelong habits of anxiety, paranoia, projection, and condemnation by the end of this video. To be honest, even over the course of several years of consistent focused inner work, you still won't have resolved this issue. Navigating our internalized projections is a lifelong process, and no bedazzlement of top 5 tips or inspirational and selective Carl Jung quotes or any form of fast food shadow work is going to get you there. This is a long process. Navigating blind spots, let's say, to put it shortly, is going to take time. It's going to take work. And a realistic view is the healing view. We shouldn't expect that our condemnations and sense of repulsion towards certain parts of ourselves or other people, beliefs or behaviors is going to disappear overnight. But it is possible to soothe and alleviate some of that suffering and some of that volatility as our internal experience. It is possible to create a sense of ego solidity, a sense of strong, discerning preferences about who we are and who we aren't, about what we like and what we don't like, with a minimal sense of triggering and volatility. And that's what we're going to explore in this video. Let's begin with an initial exploration of projection, hate bonds, and hostile imagination, which are important to understand at a conceptual level before we can begin to address the everyday symptomatic problems that we face with these processes. Generally speaking, when it comes to internal pain, it's repression, disownment, and fragmentation who are the 3 musketeers responsible for the majority of our suffering. And it's no different when it comes to unconscious projection. Fortunately, there are a wide variety of therapeutic modalities available to support us in these processes, from the body-based approaches which aim to release or resensitize different parts of our physicality, to the parts work-based approaches like internal family systems therapy, archetypal theory, or Jungian psychology. For the sake of this video, I want to narrow in on a very specific element of the wide world of unconscious projection: adversarial symbiosis. Adversarial symbiosis, a beautiful phrase which basically dances on the tongue, is the entirely normal but far from optimal state of identity creation and continual identity reinforcement based on opposition rather than autonomy. Adversarial symbiosis, a truck went past, caught me off guard. I'm now in adversarial symbiosis with that truck because it's a state of reactivity and identity formation that is based on conflict with a lot of aggression and a lot of hatred, which is why we can also call it a hate bond. It makes more sense when we think about people rather than behaviors or parts. If you take a person or a group of people who have very opposing and polarized viewpoints, they get into a mutually reinforcing kind of identity constructing dance based on their dislike of what the other group stands for. Again, this is why we call it a hate bond. It's almost like Group A and Group B need each other to sustain their sense of identity, which is based on opposition rather than a true sense of autonomy. An area where I want to shine light into about hate bonds when it comes to personal work is that it has nothing to do with the actual group or the actual person, merely our internal experience of relating to that group, person, or behavior or belief. The primary suffering point is that we're trying to defend an identity which is based on contrast rather than holding it at a certain distance, a certain level of disagreement, which is healthy, and not having that overblown sense of triggering, for lack of a better word, being triggered by that which we stand against. I'm sure you understand what I'm talking about here. I could give many examples, such as activist work. You could see it in any conventional war where there's propaganda, which I'm going to return back to, or even the battles of the sexes right now, where men and women will simultaneously pedestalize and degrade the opposite gender for this feeling of adversarial symbiosis, where I define myself as a man, for example, based on the women that I see, and especially the parts that trigger me the most and give me that sense of false identity reinforcement, which is a key point of a hate bond. A hate bond is so alluring and so captivating because anger is a more energized state than depression. Think about it. If you're apathetic or depressed, you want to lay about, you want to do very little with your day. If you're angry, charged up, ready to go, ready to fight something. And that feels like a stronger personality. And it actually is. It is stronger than depression, but it's nowhere near as strong as actually having an autonomous sense of empowerment that doesn't require belittling or generally demeaning any other group. The kind of simultaneous problem that you have with that process is you set up a superiority and inferiority complex. You see this in wars. So conventional war propaganda will simultaneously paint the enemy, in generally speaking cases, as someone or something or a group of people that are threatening us and need to be destroyed because of their overwhelming power, and yet they're also subhuman, insect-like, savage barbarians who can be easily disregarded, more of a pest or a nuisance than an actual huge threat. It's a swing between superiority and inferiority. Which one is it? It's both, because it's a hate bond. It's a symbiotic relationship where you're continuously putting yourself as superior and inferior, and of course you place yourself in a position of incredible volatility because there's no stability in that kind of situation. I think that's the best way I can explain it in a short kind of 6-minute moment. So, what are some of the solutions? If mental health and personal healing are what we're seeking, then we're looking for something like a sense of strength and safety in a personality which is more or less consistent and marked by a minimal sense of internal tension. We don't want to be too rigid or too dogmatic in our beliefs and our identity, but neither do we want to get lost in that abstract and ambiguous sense of postmodern confusion where we're afraid to make a subjective value judgment and say with confidence, this is who I am and this is who I'm not. This is what I like and this is what I don't like. When it comes to adversarial symbiosis, when it comes to healing a way of being in the world which is being reinforced through multiple mechanisms and multiple internal and external pressures throughout our lifetimes, it can seem overwhelming, it can seem impenetrable and unresolvable. But there is one perspective shift that I've seen work in myself and with those who I've supported one-to-one. It's detachment and learning to hold life lightly. It's a worldview shift. When I say detaching and holding life lightly, It means being able to use your intellect to hold the paradoxical tension of strongly believing one thing. For example, I strongly believe that as a man there are certain elements of my masculinity which are my core identity, which I stand by. There are certain elements of what it means to be a man which I really stand by. I've explored alternatives, but now I stand by these because they seem to work. So I take that in as my strong belief. But rather than being adversarial with other men who disagree with me and behave in the 180 perspective way, I can hold that tension lightly. I don't need to attack and I don't need to defend because I'm so self-assured in whatever I'm believing, right? I'll give another example. When it comes to detachment and holding life lightly, when it comes to holding that tension of the opposites at an arm's length, aware of all the contrasts, it requires a new level of intellectual capacity. Sounds kind of snobbish when you say it that way, but it does require an ability to see many different truths and be willing to hold that tension of knowing that you're not right, knowing that you're partial, and knowing that you're limited, but still staying with one rough way of being because it would be entirely paralyzing to try and consider 12 different viewpoints all the time. We can only say a few words at once, we can only embody a few values at once, especially if they're core values. How can we embody a value of discipline and hard work and also properly integrate carefree, easygoing, not work avoidance, but maybe leisure? We have to find our own internal balances. For a hate bond, we can take the view that someone else may have into ourself, which is the theoretical withdrawing of the projection you see a lot in Jungian psychology. But don't go as far to think that that means you're actually going to agree with it, or that you're actually going to embody it to a degree where you express your opponent's belief or that behavior that you disagree with in your everyday life. You just hold a bit of lightness in the back of your mind. You hold a bit less charge in your heart. There's a bit more detachment. And progressively over the course of months, as we encounter various shadow parts, various elements of ourselves that we find uncomfortable, we can create relational dialogues, relational understandings, which have a bit more sag. It's not like a tight wire, which is going to snap at any moment. It's like a loose string, which connects us to our disowned and repressed elements, and we can hopefully, after a few years of doing this, get to the point where we can lean back and smile, because we're not that thing, but we are that thing, and yet we're still gonna keep a little bit at arm's distance. I wish there were an easier solution. I wish I could say to you, this is the theoretical and the practical 5-step process. It's not the case. It is a paradoxical and complex way of being, and that is the closest that we can get, I think, unless you want to go down the spiritual bypassing straight to non-dualistic mysticism, which you can visit for moments, but when it comes to the practical everyday concerns, you have certain values that you need to live by and certain values which you're going to choose to not live by. And I think that is enough of a solution. Thank you for your attention. I'll see you next time.